Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the LiPS presentation. Our speaker today is Professor Javier Arbona-Homar, Associate Professor with a dual appointment in the Departments of American Studies and Design at the University of California, Davis. My name is Daniela. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning Program, and will be moderating the session along with my co-organizer, Rosella. After the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A. We will start the Q&A around 2:15 p.m. so that we have enough time for everyone's questions. I will be coordinating the Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion. So if you have already had a chance to ask a question, please allow others to do so before asking another one. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our speaker today. Professor Javier Arbona-Homar is a Puerto Rican geographer and associate professor with a dual appointment in American Studies and Design at the University of California, Davis. He was previously a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in American Studies at Davis, UC Humanities Research Institute, residential research fellow on civil wars, and a Ford Foundation dissertation fellow at UC Berkeley. He researches the spatial politics of landscapes shaped by explosions, or the latent potential thereof, and the racial conditions of explosions. His new research dives into topics such as explosive atmospheres, the historical geography of dynamite logistics, the mobility of remains and memory from the so-called Spanish-American War, and the theorization of transoceanic coloniality. In today's talk, Professor Javier will draw from his new book, Explosivity, Following What Remains, as well as present his new research to critically examine deeply held assumptions about appearance and disappearances in landscapes. More than an academic book, Explosivity is a vital guide to confronting the latent violence embedded in our environments. It's a call for slowing down, sensing, and remembering what remains of historical explosions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Javier Arbona-Homar.
Gracias, Daniela, Rosela, Hayes. Also, I wanted to thank Kian for trying to help organize this trip that in the end, because of the shutdown, I was not able to make it. As I was saying earlier, just informally, I'm really heartbroken not to be there in person for this event, but with the shutdown, it became all like a domino effect of the possibilities of the delay with other meetings and family obligations here. So, sort of had to make the final decision on Sunday. But I do hope that in the future we can make this happen. And I really appreciate, one of the best parts of, I think, my work is to engage with grad students. And so I'm really excited to be in conversation with all of you and learning from you. And yeah, I hope in the future we can make this happen in person or see some of you over here on the West Coast. I will say also just one quick caution. There are some passages in this talk that involve bodily injury and self-inflicted harm, given the topic of explosivity and explosives. So just a heads up if you need to step out. So let me just dive in. As a geographer, my work is about appearances and disappearances in landscapes. Who appears or disappears and where, under what conditions? For example, because recently I'm coming back to thinking about my own positionality and ethnicity. I'm from the US colony of Puerto Rico. When and where can Puerto Ricans be named? For which national causes and wars? For wars on terror, for example. When, if ever, can we refuse to appear, as has been part of an ongoing struggle with a private foundation that's been trying to develop a Pulse nightclub memorial in Florida at this site of a mass shooting that then became kind of enmeshed in all the politics of anti-Muslim hate due to the shooter and reasons for colonial wars. What remains and what disappears and why? And these are questions that are never too far from my mind in the context of ongoing genocides. And my findings, building on my first book-length project, Explosivity, Following What Remains, now with new projects that you'll hear a little bit about, revealed to me that I'm searching for myriad traces of imperialism, often in ways that they're missed or misunderstood. And I'm committed to dismantling the coloniality of landscape that's too often just taken as a veiling device. In turn, I want to learn about the everyday appearance of empire and its quotidian domesticity, a comfort with empire and colonialism that is decidedly not hidden in plain sight. So in this example that I'm showing on the screen, the unknown Spanish soldier who was killed by the United States in the 1898 war to occupy Puerto Rico are buried and preserved in the small town of Jauco. And they're cared under US preservation law into the present day. So the Spanish soldier appears, right, in landscape while all the while, Puerto Ricans, or for example, Puerto Rican women victims of femicides disappear, or for example, just really quick, kind of beaches that disappear, bodies that disappeared after Hurricane Maria, schools that have been closed by US criminality, again, like the cemetery destroyed in the toll of Hurricane Maria. Just a couple of clippings from the news to sort of show all this. And so in this light too, my new project that I've been working on that I tentatively call Monumental Disappearance seeks landscape evidence of empire's visibility. It questions the commonplace notion that I think I also took as a certainty that empire hides in landscapes, and these landscapes, ecologies, natures hide empire. And I say this with all due respect to, tons of texts that I learn and books that I learn a lot from. And this also is like, kind of a conceit that I've also repeated throughout my career. So I'm thinking about how I study the monumentality of empire, but especially the scale of its dispersal, its debris, its particles, its temperatures, wastes, discards, waters from wars and securitization as they scatter and settle across landscapes, claiming and securing sovereignty. And finally, I'm interested in how to sense remotely such a dispersed archive of coloniality and everyday landscapes, and especially now with a look at, as Daniela mentioned very quickly, the so-called America's war with Spain from the late 19th century and into the 20th, which was much more than a single war against just a single enemy, and it's ongoing into the present day. And it continues to be mythified as a kind of the beginnings of an overseas empire, which I think is also like something I'm interested in really kind of deconstructing. So my I guess I can still say it's new, came out earlier this year. My new book, Explosivity, is now what I'm going to focus on for most of the rest of the talk, but I'll come back a little bit and at the very end to sort of talk again about disappearance. And today's talk is going to be adapted a bit from the preface and from parts of the introduction. And then I'm going to jump to the 5th chapter in the book that's about the production or creation of the accident. And then I'll talk a little bit from the conclusion. I'll say just really quickly for those of you here with us and on the Zoom, in person and in Zoom, the book is something that it doesn't tell like a kind of chronological history. It is grounded, as you'll hear about, in the region of the San Francisco Bay Area. But the way that the book sort of takes various explosive moments, these get woven into the chapters in almost a collagist way. And so each chapter focuses on certain consequences of this concept that I call explosivity. And you'll hear more about why, where that term comes from. And so that's why like the chapters, I look at how the suspect is produced, how punishment is produced, the memorial, landscape, accident. And finally, in the concluding chapter, I talk about remains as also a methodology. So my experience visiting the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial in California sent me off in unexpected directions. Since 2010, I've been periodically visiting the Port Chicago Memorial when the U.S. Army allows on the shores of the Suisun Bay, 42 miles northeast of the city of San Francisco. And I've gone on organized National Park Service tours and to the annual commemorative event that you see a little clipping of there, and also on less structured visits with park rangers setting up for the annual event to be held on the following day. In the summer of 1944, two World War II, let me turn my page, ammunition ships docked at this site, blew up in rapid succession at this segregated, what was at the time a segregated munitions port. The memorial both centered my attention on this landscape and shot me out searching afar, not quite sure what I would find. Resisting the sentimental closure imposed by this and in fact most memorials, I decided I had to follow what remains of the deceased somewhere else. But what remains? Despite a memorial and any memorial's design strategy to control the conditions of grieving, what remains after a disaster, matter, memory, narratives, goes beyond sentimentality. Remains are political, to state the obvious, remains travel and take the living with them to other places. I had to follow what remains with more discipline than what the memorial dictated. Far from a place where death happened, remains are all manner of scattered matter. Remains are even more than matter itself. Memories go with living caretakers and advocates, and the flesh, even in its absence, stays with a diverse public committed to the preservation of memory. In the cases I found by going outwards from the Port Chicago Memorial, some of the many people caring for memory are groups like workers, activists, protesters, storytellers, along with many and storytellers, along with many kinds of artifacts that dynamically travel further out from a staid memorial locked inside an active army port. The people in this photograph I found in the Robert Allen papers are survivors of that explosion in 1944. Most of them are survivors of the explosion. Allen did not leave like names on anywhere that I could find on the photograph, even though I recognize some of them. I'm not exactly sure who all of them are by name. So I didn't put that in the caption, but I have some sense of some of them. And he passed away just as I was finishing the book too. So I was trying to reach him, but I don't think he was in good health. And so I didn't get those, unfortunately. Along these vectors of movement, I stumbled upon the efforts to pacify, hold, silence, and pathologize the memory of survivors and other participants as part of their politics. As I followed what remains, I encountered more comparable cases regionally, and region here really matters in this project. And I questioned if the 1944 Port Chicago explosion and a subsequent wildcat strike, many of these people in the photograph participated in that strike against Navy segregation, had been all that unique. It turns out that it wasn't. This book came out of taking my previous research, Remains of Another Sort, to more sites for connections across spaces using a methodology of attunements, among more approaches. And just really quick, I'll talk, I don't know how, I'm not sure how big this is on your screen over there, but the book focuses, it kind of draws mostly from 5 case studies. And I've been talking about the Port Chicago explosion here to the north that I'm trying to circle with my mouse here. But the book spans an explosion that happened at a Wells Fargo depot in 1866. A Western Fuse, a manufacturer, an explosion you'll hear a little bit more about today at Western Fuse in what is present-day Oakland. As I said, the 1944 Port Chicago explosion, a 1990 explosion still unsolved of Earth First environmentalist activist Judy Barry, and then an explosion during the shooting of the show Mythbusters, an episode called Cannonball in 2011. And so these all sort of weave throughout the book, and they're interrelated often in surprising ways by certain characters or by certain kind of experts who travel or who move between these, or victims that move between these different sites. But also the book takes from many more explosions that took place in the Bay Area that are not as protagonist in the story of the book, but still sort of really fill out its entire kind of evidentiary panorama, if you will. So now I'm going to jump to the part on scales of explosivity in the San Francisco Bay Area, drawing from the introduction of the book. Grant Imahara was a well-known engineer, inventor, and host of the Mythbusters television program. He died in 2020 at 49 years of age. Discovery Network explained the cause of death as a brain aneurysm, the silent killer, the so-called silent killer. He experienced excruciating headaches in the days before his passing, which is a telling symptom. But the underlying trigger of Imahara's reported aneurysm is unknown, and I just want to be clear, my text is not a diagnosis of brain injury. Tens of thousands of people experience aneurysms in the US each year, and it is estimated that worldwide, 500,000 people perish from the condition. Aneurysms are generally a known risk for stunt performers and actors on dangerous productions. This condition of the arteries pouching outward and sometimes bursting into the brain has injured stunt actors on shows like Jackass and Lord of the Rings. An aneurysm can be analogized with an undetected explosive package in the brain. On the Mythbusters set, when an explosion would get out of hand, cast members would often reassure audiences that, quote, no one was injured during the filming. But ailments like aneurysms complicate the temporality of injury. In 2009, filming the Knock Your Socks Off episode, the crew ignited 500 pounds of ammonium nitrate. The premise of the episode was to challenge the myth that an explosion could knock socks off a pair of mannequin legs. The femme-presenting mannequin legs, and only the legs, oddly, were carefully arranged at different radii from the explosion in the center of concentric rings painted on the ground. But the shockwave radiating out of the Yolo County Sheriff's bombing range, where Mythbusters would sometimes shoot, blasted out windows and rocked the entire neighboring town of Esparto, northeast of Sacramento, which recently actually was in the news here in California due to a large fireworks warehouse disaster. I quote, I found myself lying down on the floor and the dogs going wild, said a resident. The same person told television news that it was fun, really fun, and the network replaced her windows the same day. The explosion registered as a small tremor on seismographs, and one cast member was pregnant on the set. Like the incipient nitroglycerin package of the mid-19th century that I mentioned before, the Wells Fargo Depot in 1866 on the map, the aneurysm can be at a different scale an expression of the same explosivity, which is a vocabulary term that I take from volcanology. This explosivity manifests in proximity as a physical force that can damage buildings, but it is also something that is culturally embraced as quote unquote fun, even used by some expecting parents to celebrate so-called gender reveals, which have initiated wildfires, destroyed homes, and caused fatal disasters. And that's even without mentioning their intended gender violence. And here's kind of an example, right, where crass humor that involves explosivity is used to sort of talk about the canon as kind of, it doubles as a phallus. And so there's also that gendered aspect to it. So as a form of media, audiences since the 19th century have sought out the entertainments of what I refer to in the book as the city of explosivity. For example, viewing San Francisco's offshore rocks and islands and shoals blown up to the size of aggregate, or the socks flying off of a disembodied mannequin leg as Mythbusters did. So this would become a spectacle that people would go out to see, just islands just being destroyed, blown up to smithereens. On another level, the aneurysm is more than metaphoric. They are linked to physical energy, to the physical energy of an explosion's shockwave, yet they attack at a later space and time. Like a package or traumatic memory, they can be linked back to the logistics of explosives from outer geographies to the geographies inside the body lying in wait. Mythbusters purported to tell truths to bust myths, as the name plainly promises. Instead, as case studies of the show will help to reveal, they mythologized explosivity through its mediatization. They also did this at the very geographic sites inherited from previous militarization and securitization, such as filming with the assistance, land, and supervision of the police forces, violently reshaping California landscapes in the process. So they would use the same, what had been previously military bases become police sites that then become also double as production sites for the show, right? The book Explosivity, my book, is an experiment with addressing the problem of sensing explosivity in landscapes, and in turn, an experiment with the practices of writing about landscapes. The project entwines situated practices of walking, writing, standing, sitting still, and breathing at sites of militarized, mass-produced, and racialized death. And in the conclusion of the book, I explore more these methods. The situated research work that I read about has been performed with and draws from various activities on individual and collective site walks, including with the D. Collective, the artistic collaboration I co-founded in 2010 with Brian Finocchi and Nick Sowers. The name shortens the phrase decoding military landscapes, but it can also be misread, as people oftentimes would do, as delimit, right? As delimit, right? Which has associations with practicing the on-foot sensing of a military perimeter, delimiting something, right? Going around it. The connection that demillet seeks to make is between myriad militarizations in a single place. Where we have been based, the San Francisco Bay Area, as it is the crux of making, exporting, and using weapons and explosive, and is a Spanish settler's place name for what are, and where I am right now, the unceded lands of several dozen Ohlone and Miwok groups. The book is also a study that reveals the past registration and the latent power of explosivity in landscapes. Put differently, it reveals the industrialization and mass reproduction of geophysical energy crucial to capitalism's unfolding as imprinted upon violently colonized landscapes. Explosivity necessitates specific bounded places like the many experimental and manufacturing facilities and properties in and around the Bay Area or the Sheriff's bombing range, as discussed before, but also disperses dangers and risks spatially. And this is where dynamite was first produced in the United States, Glen Park today. This is facing Mare Island. I can show you the map in a little bit, and I'll point that out. I grounded the study in the geography of San Francisco and the greater Bay Area as a paradigmatic case study in the racial logistics that facilitate explosivity. And this aerial view that I'm showing right here, there's like one tree, right? Like I think it's the only tree basically in the foreground that I'm hovering over that's on the outskirts of this waste treatment plant. But just below that tree is a small community-placed plaque that commemorates the strike by those sailors, veterans that you saw in an earlier photograph in the talk, who were survivors, strikers of the Chicago explosion that I started with in the talk. But if the study of the Bay Area holds place-specific secrets of the logistics that enable explosive technologies, and that goes all the way into the more or less the present day, including with nuclear weapons, and places help to tell the story of explosivity, this study is also paradoxical. It calls for attention precisely because the crucial feature of explosivity is its own self-destructiveness. This feature makes explosivity partly unarchivable due to its inherent capacities to delete traces from landscapes and archives. If memory has been one of the major concerns of 20th and 21st century philosophers and critical theorists, the concept of explosivity contributes and complicates such a study of memory. Rather than only relying on theorization of contemporary states of detachment and distraction by popular media and post-traumatic erasures of memory by wars and violence, explosivity shows a more immediate, direct way of destroying radical and collective memory. Geographer Seth Lunine makes a key point that, quote, California possessed only 7 of the nation's 22 dynamite manufacturers in 1880, Yet these California companies accounted for about 90% of all capital investment and over 70% of aggregate national output, right? End quote. Almost all of these manufacturers clustered in the region of the Bay. This is in downtown San Francisco. I'll say a little bit more. This is close to that site of the 1866 explosion in the book. This makes the region, right, the city and region, a significant and in some ways unique case study because it ties together manufacturing and militarization regionally. The region, as an urban headquarters of a global chemical transformation, was made and shaped with explosive and combustive substances and records that transformation in the landscapes themselves that exceed drawn property lines or landmark sites of heritage. But how to detect explosivity in this historic birthplace of explosivity out of many more? This is more challenging than may seem because of inherent and problematic geographic scales at which explosivity manifests itself. Sometimes a distractively huge blast leaves little trace, and likewise, such traces are predominantly small particulate matter. And this photograph where this is taken close to that explosion of nitroglycerin that Alfred Nobel shipped to the United States in 1866, right, has been completely filled in. So even though this had like a bomb-turbated landscape, really like left a crater at that site, it's basically been completely, you could say, erased, right? Similarly, this is where strikers after the Port Chicago strike that, I started the story with, and you saw the survivors in an earlier photo, they were put on trial for that strike and accused of mutiny at this site that is basically a parking lot, just sort of facing. You can see the Bay Bridge in the background there. And so again, kind of also trying to think in a very situated way about the particulate, the smallness, the granular, the sort of rubble of a parking lot or the stones of like just the aggregate matter as sort of the remnant evidence of that explosivity. As architectural historians Dubravka Sekulic, Milika Tomic, and Philip Sattler express, and I hope I pronounce those sort of correctly, but I'm not sure. Quote, colonial practices having spread across territories and soils and once confined to the colonial context continue to inform our ideas of minerals, species, race, and gender, permeating our behavior, institutions, and imaginary to the present day, end quote. So drawing on words from scalar thinkers like these, I take that one must be attentive to particulate scales of dispersion to understand the convenient elusiveness of colonial memory and the forgetting of catastrophic events. My approach further interprets the idea of intimacy to draw connections that would go otherwise unnoticed. Early technologies of combustible embodiments, explosive chemicals taken up in and around bodies, connect to the industrialized dispersal of volatile toxic particulate that remain at nearly invisible scales in landscapes today. The unequal toxic dispersal of explosivity connects too to the police persecution of the very same racial suspects marked as all too proximate to volatility, past and present, and targeted for concentrated particulate pollution. Put differently, vulnerabilities along race and class to environmental risk and police persecution are more than merely comparable across historic periods in the Bay Area. They're ongoing and co-created by suspicion and exposure, intertwined, right? And so explosivity helps consider the continuities between, for example, the racial exploitation of Chinese workers in the early years of post-gold rush California to the plantation-like segregated ammunition depots of World War II. So in this image, that's a cartoon from the 1800s, from 1882, there's a racialization of disease and of, communicable illnesses supposedly concentrated in Chinatown, but that same vaporousness and that same sort of that same atmospheric kind of racialization is something that I also connect to the ways in which Chinese workers were also exposed to explosives in the explosives manufacturing process, which they oftentimes were either left to die or were deposited back in Chinatown without even being admitted to hospitals. And this is a site of burials. This image on right here, this monument is where there are unidentified remains of, so it's a so-called pauper cemetery, but these are mostly Chinese migrants who perished in California and whose remains couldn't be sent back to China. Um, let's see, where did I leave off? Or to provide another example, from the early policing of explosivity in the 19th century to the police's infrastructural control of explosivity and their development of bombing ranges after World War II, as we go to next. So again, just making also that connection between the 19th century exposure, especially for Chinese migrants, to then 20th century, the ways in which ammunition depots were similarly plantation-like in their concentrated exposure against black stevedores or sailors, as you met earlier. Okay, so now we're going to take a moment to make a jump to chapter 5. We're going to see more about the kind of production and instrumentality of the accident in explosivity and what produces the accident. So on YouTube, there's an edited reel with a roundtable conversation between, let's see, I'll just leave it here for a moment, with a roundtable conversation between the Mythbusters cast about their so-called worst day ever. The worst day in the show's run from 2003 to 2016 was the Cannonball incident. The episode, called Cannonball Chemistry, was filmed on location at the Alameda County Sheriff's Bombing Range in Dublin, California, which is an outer suburb of the city of San Francisco, kind of in the East Bay. And I'll show a map in a moment so that you can situate that. The production mishap took place on December 6, 2011. And so we started this talk right here to the north. I showed this map before, but this is where Port Chicago is in the memorial. This is the San Francisco Wells Fargo explosion of 1866 that you just saw that downtown image in the slide earlier. And the part I'm narrating now, I'm hovering over this other red dot, which is the Cannonball episode, right? Oh, and let me also just kind of go back to one thing here. In the geo stories that I narrate in the book, this bombing range that you see in this image is the layered location of 1940 of the Port Chicago explosions, hospitalizations, and interrogations of the explosion's Black survivor strikers, as well as present day, the vicinity of Santa Rita Jail. So here you can see this kind of co-location of, over time, over like many, many decades, both military base, like former naval base, site of interrogations and of hospitalizations during World War II, to present day policing, securitization, practices, explosives, testing, and detonations and destruction, and incarceration at Santa Rita Jail. There's a federal facility, another federal prison a little bit farther off in the distance from this photograph. The roundtable conversation cuts to a piece of footage borrowed from a nightly news program with a chyron under the Telecaster that says "set accident." But the set was not a soundstage or production studio. It was an actual law enforcement bombing and disposal range. Accident is another term used in a way that raises a question. The act of firing the cannonball had been planned and supervised for recording the show. The cannon, according to the show star Jamie Heineman, had quote-unquote muzzle lift, but all firearms run the risk of shooting off target because of explosive recoil. Therefore, muzzle lift is to be expected. What happened more specifically was that the production team shot a 30-pound round stone projectile from a cannon loaded with gunpowder and missed the target of a mocked up, and in reality it was a cinder block, so-called castle wall. They were trying to test the myth if indeed a cannon could puncture a castle. Instead, the cannonball skipped off of a hill. The shooting projectile, quote unquote, took an unforeseen bounce from a safety berm, according to Discovery Channel, and landed 700 yards away. The cannon had overshot a defensive line of water drums meant to stop the show's projectiles and flew over the bomb range's fence, screeching through the air above several residential blocks and a creek, and then bounced into an adjoining suburban subdivision called Tassajara Creek at a time of day when children were returning home from school. It appears that the cannonball flew through a family's home, then bounced around like a pinball, popped through interior drywall, leaving a perfectly circular hole, flying over a napping toddler and a parent, and then crashing through the bedroom wall onto a busy road and shattering a neighboring house's roof shingles in the process. The cannonball finally came to rest on a Toyota Sienna minivan. Wired magazine described the incident as, quote, only slightly less strange than something you might see in a Looney Tunes cartoon, end quote. And that's a really interesting also connection to Looney Tunes because, of course, like Looney Tunes, the Roadrunner and Coyote are also classically about like all about explosives and about this kind of humor and funness, right, around explosives. The minivan belonged to Jasper Jill, who parked the vehicle 10 minutes earlier. When Jill and his teenage son returned, according to the news report, they found the ball on the floorboards with glass everywhere and an obliterated dashboard. Gill told reporters, quote, it's shocking. Anything could have happened. But this was not the first instance of projectiles from the sheriff's bombing range hitting area homes. Quote, in 2007, a stray .223 caliber bullet, apparently fired during a training exercise at Camp Park's Army base in Dublin, shattered the bedroom window of a San Ramon home, end quote. That Camp Park's Army base that I just mentioned in that quote is the very same Alameda County bombing range, right? That then the police come around to inherit that same base. The episode aired almost a year after the filming snafu, despite assurances not to air this traumatic footage on November 11th, 2012. But you wouldn't think it was possible. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1898 Western Fuse explosion to think more about this idea of possibility and, the possibility and thinkability of the accident. Searching historical newspapers for subsequent follow-ups to the news of a July 19th, 1898 explosion at the Western Fuse and Explosives Factory, I came across a telling adjacency. Western Fuse was in what was known as the Melrose neighborhood. It's a mixed industrial and residential area on the wetlands of what is present-day Oakland. And let me just go right there, sorry. So, there's a strip of repair yards, warehouses, railroad tracks, industrial facilities. And this building that has the self-storage warehouse is pretty close or basically on top of the site of what was then in the 1898 Western Fuse, where the explosion happened. And so that's between the Nimitz Freeway and International Boulevard in Oakland. On Sunday, October 23rd, 1898, the San Francisco Call ran an arrest report about a Melrose resident. That's what the neighborhood was called then. No one says that anymore, but that was the name for the neighborhood back then. 60-year-old widow Maggie Donahue, committed by a judge to a mental institution in Ukiah in Northern California. Quote, her wrecked mind is the direct result of the terrible Melrose explosion of several months ago, the article stated. Donahue was a survivor of the unsolved blast that killed at least 6 people, including the alleged perpetrator, a Chinese worker of the factory, as well as 5 police officers. Allegedly, Donahue was wandering neighborhood streets at night with a whip and a lit candle, demanding that the police come to protect her house because, as the jailer at the police station claimed, she imagined that, quote, similar explosions have been taking place almost nightly and that her house shakes almost continuously, end quote. Her late husband was a Civil War veteran, unclear for which side. Donahue had also allegedly threatened neighbors with a weapon because she suspected that they wanted to plant dynamite under her home. After quoting the jailer in the following sentence with the objective tone of the news report, she was said to speak, quote, intelligently on all other subjects. The news categorized her response to explosivity as mentally unstable, even though a catastrophic explosion had taken place just 3 months prior, dismissing her and her fears and banished by a judge to an asylum. Donahue's nighttime meanderings were presented as unhinged fears, particularly accentuated by the fact that these were out of character, and she was, quote unquote, not a nervous woman, according to the reporter, nor, quote, easily given to fright, but has always been regarded by her neighbors as a woman of remarkable nerve. Known to have sewed up the bodies of 14 victims of a yellow fever outbreak at sea and buried them in the deep. Donahue's story exposes, first, a consensus of police, health, courts, and press that settles back into enforcing tolerance and acceptance of explosivity in everyday life, even though 5 officers had died in the Melrose explosion. And second, Donahue's expectation and prediction of another explosion had to be pathologized and gendered to reestablish the surprise and unexpectedness associated with explosivity. The Donahue case shows a lack of memory for explosivity to function and juridically enforced. Right. Let's go back for a moment to the site of Mythbusters. So over a century after the Melrose explosion, Mythbusters would weave similar threads between recording and forgetting explosivity, and doing so with assistance of the police too. The show often filmed inside the sheriff's bomb range, and that is about 25 miles from the site of the Melrose explosion. J.D. Nelson, a sergeant with the sheriff's department and bomb technician, assisted on the ill-fated cannonball chemistry episode we were on before. On the former Twitter network account for the show, Mythbusters introduced Nelson as, quote, the sheriff who helped us with many of our greatest explosions, including Cannonball. Whether advisable or not, Nelson served as both an explosives consultant for the production and a spokesperson for the sheriff's department. To explain the mishap, he said, quote, you wouldn't think it was possible. You wouldn't think it was possible, echoing over 110 years through the nexus of explosivity that could seize Maggie Donahue as a deranged woman imagining explosions. Nelson navigates between the roles of officer and consultant, lending a veneer of confidence and veracity to a program that centers on dangerous experiments. When events go off script, who investigates? Mythbuster stars allege that the errant cannonball, like a red warning signal, quote, saved us. But saved from what? Was it from their own inclination to push the technical boundaries of explosives, from injuring themselves, or from organized protests from neighbors? It's unclear. The routine answers given as part of entertainment media may seem like deflection, but at the same time, like Donahue's detention, they reveal deeper certainties about safety within the larger uncertainty of explosivity. To the teamed up producers of visual effects and the explosive experts of the state, safety comes as after the fact, balanced with sustaining exposure to hazards. Going back to Maggie Donahue's wanderings in the nighttime of the city of explosivity may not have been so off the mark, more premonition than delusion. Or perhaps not even a premonition, because it didn't take psychic powers to predict that another explosion would soon go off. On the same page that the article about Donahue's insanity story ran, the leftmost column of the paper ran another story with the following headline: hurled into eternity by an explosion. That next explosion, and I'll go a few minutes past 8 in the morning, was reportedly made by, quote unquote, a couple hundred pounds of nitroglycerin that went off inside the separate wooden building for mixing the chemical at the Judson Powder Works, an explosives plant to the west of Albany Hill on Fleming Point, north of Berkeley. And that's actually right out the window here, and killed at least 2 workers. Donahue, I mean, what was back then, it's not there anymore, but what was right out here, Fleming Point, just north of Berkeley, and killed at least 2 workers. Donahue could have arrived at the Ukiah Asylum over 100 miles to the north, institutionalized for anticipating a blast exactly like the one that happened about 10 or 11 miles from her home, taken away on the same day, but a few hours before the blast that would have confirmed her worst fears. More than a century later, when the California Department of Transportation prepared to build a freeway over what had been the past Melrose neighborhood, its archaeologists were amazed. And by their admission in a report, they use that word, amazed, right? Like that's taken directly as a quote, to discover documentation of the 1898 Western Fuse explosion. Their own amazement is exemplary of something constitutive, something foundation to the permanence of explosivity, like the pathologization of fears as well. Over the course of these illustrative cases, there is a pattern of making explosivity infrastructural, from wily and unpredictable chemical origin to more elaborate layers of managing it deeper into the landscape in dedicated spaces to its testing, circulation, like this freeway, and alleged securitization. But then an event like the Cannonball episode pierces through such normalcy that helps to make explosivity infrastructural. So now to wrap up and to sort of draw a little bit from the conclusion, um, I'm gonna go to a part where I draw from certain perambulations and walking and kind of staying with this explosion in this vicinity, right at this corner of like that warehouse building that you see to the right of the screen there. Um, So after a visit to the 1898 site in Oakland on a Saturday in mid-August of 2021, I wrote some notes on my phone. Quote, want to capture the uncertainty of the location of the explosion, a kind of mapping question, basically, but also in a different way, a very, very challenging site to navigate due to the freeway on-ramps and the sheer sensorial overload of dirt, noise, and activity, end quote. The purpose of the visit, in part, was to try to better locate that site of the 1898 detonation, but the streets were not aligning perfectly with historical maps and proved to be somewhat frustrating if committed to attaining a very precise cartography, which we weren't. And this is drawing from like a visit with my collaborators in DMillet. But the overwhelming weight of dust matter and particulate at the location from the past, the freeway, the hot tires of traffic, the metal galvanizing shops nearby, felt like it held its own secrets suspended over the general area of the blast. I took some of my collaborators on this visit, and in the direction I had sent to them, I highlighted quote unquote our explosive moment with a hyperlink to a Google map of the corner where 45th Avenue meets Coliseum Way. Let's go back to that image. So that's right there where that kind of close to where that white pickup truck is, right in the middle. Um, uh, the closest I thought we could come to the perimeter of the 1898 explosion. I was trying to make sense of how we would traverse from this explosive moment to continue to meander underneath the huge freeway, then arrive at the edge of the estuary canal to walk along the Oakland shoreline where pedestrian access is limited. After many visits, the area continues, even to this day, I've gone several times again, to be sensorially overwhelming. Documents have never really filled gaps in the experience of the site. In my own notes, I wrote that, quote, I really was struck by the incredible weight of particulate there, just sandy, dusty, debris-filled, and full of vehicle emissions. In a sense, those are the monuments mixed with the archaeological, atmospherically and terrestrially, the archaeological remnants and human remains of the explosion, end quote. The atmospheric monument of this explosive moment is, as a collaborator observed, archaeologically preserved under infrastructure. And, quote, we can continue to probe at it, but the not knowing remains also the object for documentation. Does the atmospheric monument we visited contain codes with which to decipher the not knowingness of the detonation of the 1898 Western fuse explosion? At that location, where past explosions and various combustions intermix in the air in an indigenous socioecology, a question comes to mind. Critical disability studies scholar Javier asks, quote, how can climate change be rethought to dissipate a linear temporality and causal fixation in favor of complex assemblages of atmospherics that account for the intersections of ableism, speciesism, and racism, end quote. Could this atmospheric monument of the freeway encode an archive of the violent conditions of the settler colonial waterfront where Chinese migrants were forced to work in explosives amidst racial terror? Does the atmospheric monument include the many firebombed Chinatowns throughout California and the Pacific Northwest? And one that was right here below this warehouse, the workers at the explosives plant were basically held in what you could call dormitories, right? Like a mini Chinatown of sorts that was on the premises of the Western Fuse manufacturer. Um, Keeping Puar's provocation in mind, such an alternate site like the overlapping freeway over the explosion site can be a place where climate experiences and even breathing in dissipate, in Puar's word, the established temporalities of this seemingly, right, this overwhelming, seemingly finalized atmospheric empire of so many accumulated blasts. Further notes from that visit to the explosive moment remind me to quote, to remember too, that this was a significant explosive year because of the mystery bombing of the USS Maine in Havana that starts the Spanish-American War. And this explosion shares space in the newspapers with the invasion of the Philippines, if I recall correctly. That's what I wrote in my notes. So I went back to check that out, right? So on the morning of July 20th, 1898, the Los Angeles Herald, for example, posted a headline in all caps letters, an awful suicide. Chinese blows himself up in a powder mill. And this was about the Western Fuse explosion in Oakland. Headlines on the same pages point at how the U.S. occupation of the Philippines was going from, quote, news from the Orient. Captain Daniel H. Hodgson, officer of the McCulloch steamer in Commodore George Dewey's so-called Asiatic Squadron, was in Hong Kong, making his way back to San Francisco from the Battle of Manila Bay. Further down the page, dispatches state that Secretary of War Russell Alger ordered General Nelson Miles to set sail for C-1A Cuba for port, and in their spelling, Puerto Rico, immediately and without delay. 5 days later, Miles would land in Guanica. So this seems like a decent place to finish as one project closes and another one opens up next. My own personal geographic imagination as Puerto Rican and having experienced this ongoing intensified occupation, shuttling to and from colonized lands here and there, may somehow help to untangle empire through decolonial methods of following what remains, human and more than human. After 1898's explosion of the Maine helped to birth the transoceanic empire and then was dutifully forgotten. Or was it, right? That's really the question that I'm trying to grapple with next. So as I turn away from Explosivity, the book, let me just turn for a moment to the beginning and a little bit about the new work that I mentioned before. How hidden or disappearing is a brutal, undemocratic empire? Just as an example, a map of a national audit of United States 1898 war monuments reveals over 320 entries in the Monument Lab monument audit. Not to be redundant, but even while some may be false positives, most of these are valid. And it depends how you count these because sometimes like a site can have like 3 plaques, let's say, for example. So does it count as 3 or does it count as 1? But nevertheless, you know, I take the numbers to be well over 300. So how hidden are these sorts of remnants and remains and debris and pieces of the War of 1898, how hidden are they for colonized subjects? Note too that in these maps, I've been also kind of trying to study how, like, Puerto Rico is still not included in this audit, for example. So paradoxically enough, the burial site that I showed you in the beginning, the unknown soldier tomb, is still not in this audit. And so there's something quite an interesting contradiction between those that are mapped and those that are off the map that actually have a certain meaning about what is visibility, what is a kind of visual oppression, what is a kind of appearance. And so to conclude, and this is really where I'm kind of going into more speculative directions now with my new research, this is the site of the Miles landing in Guanica, Puerto Rico. And here are two artists who are taking a kind of like a latex inscription of the landing. What is this commemorative landing rock, right? Where the US colonized Puerto Rico. And so you see that kind of geobody of sorts that outlines the rock, right? And this was produced to be used in a performance by the incredible choreographer Nivia Pastrana Santiago. And so kind of thinking a lot about that question I mentioned before, like, to whom is this invisible? To whom is this visible, right? So to colonize subjects, right? Just to show you, oops, this should go to one more, oh, sorry, one more image where there's nothing metaphoric about this. They're quite literally stepping on that landing site. And I wanted to just conclude with that. Thank you very much for listening, and I would be more than happy to chat with you all a little bit more. And I will take a moment. I don't know if I can hear you, but also if you, really quick, this is the only like sort of marketing that I'll do. I always kind of like, it's always awkward to do that part, but if you go to my bio link, which you can just type in lnk.bio and /JAH, and I can just drop this into the chat too, but it's easy enough to find. This has like a link directly to University of Minnesota Press. You can take a photo of the screen if you want and just take this code. I'm told that the discount code is good till the end of the year. So you can also, I can also ask Daniela to share this. But yeah, or either or feel free to take a photo of the slide and take this, and take this with you. So yeah, thank you. I don't know how, if Daniela would like to convey the questions or if I can hear the audience, but
Yeah, thank you, Javier, for your presentation. I don't know if there's any question from, like, you can raise your hand and. I have a question. Um, you were talking about how in your methods, how using remains as a part of a methodology, and also you were mentioning how this kind of like sensorial aspect of it, and you mentioned breathing as well. So I don't know if you can expand on that. I got really curious about that part. Yeah, thank you.
sure. I mean, I think that, one of the things about, let me see how I can answer that question without getting like too, I don't know, like too, um, in a way, kind of too metaphysical about it or anything, because it's not. But when I think about, I mean, for example, one way in which I think it, breathing is first of all like unavoidable in a site like next to the Western Fuse explosion site, right? Anywhere, but like especially in a site where breathing becomes difficulted and becomes sensorially more activated. And so like my kind of questions, I think when I was in the process of trying to sort out like what should I write about and what am I doing to acknowledge the violence of these sites? Like how am I kind of really sitting with this? Partly the very act of breathing becomes, for one thing, a kind of like I drew on those quotes from those field notes at the very sort of towards the end of the talk, right? really has to do with trying to access these sites in ways that they're definitely not labeled or marked or landmarked. So that's one like physical practice that I think becomes part of a different sort of archiving, and a sort of way to just also, as Jasper Poor talks about, like also to even like physically dissipate one's own sort of like sense that this infrastructure is all powerful, right? And that it's like a terminated kind of thing in the landscape, right? When it turns out that if you really slow down and sense the site in many different ways, you start to really feel the way in which it's actually like you're basically over the water, or you're over a very kind of spongy site that they have built this freeway, and the freeways actually have fallen in earthquakes in the past too, parts of freeways, right? So like that kind of dominance of empire, if you will, that kind of physicality of these infrastructures as more fragile than they may seem. Like I think that for me, it's been important to sensorially try to access that. Um, Breathing is also something that I started to kind of try to think about the way. So, and this is like during the pandemic, I was trying to like really understand the ways in which, again, I think I mentioned this question earlier in the talk. Explosivity is very hard to kind of access, to sensorially touch, or to perceive, or even like encounter in documents, right? Because it is self-destructive, because of the way in which explosions have this very convenient way of destroying the very conditions of their own making, or of who planted the explosive, or right, like, so because they can have that inherently destructive force against memory, against forms of radical memory, I start to really kind of ponder, and this is kind of like in the depth of the pandemic too. Like I was really trying to ponder, is there like a larger kind of geophysics of explosivity, the universal Big Bang? What are the geophysics of ignition, of combustion, of the movement of an explosion through space, that we could somehow like kind of try to sense physically without risking one's life, but that could perhaps, how does one sit with gravity, for example, as a way to sense the Big Bang, right? Like to even come into contact with a larger explosivity, which is, after all, what science draws from to produce reproducible explosivity, to make mass-produced explosivity as an industrialized form of mass death, of infrastructural development, of mining, of extraction, of, right, like of drawing fossil fuels, etc. So like I was really kind of trying to go, like I was really in my head trying to figure out, how do I even figure out methodologically some way of like almost coming into contact with or touching that force, right? And so breathing, also like sitting with or breathing, can be a way to like actually sense that gravity, to even like sense that in your own body, like even sensing the drop of your own organs, for example, just like really being like in your own shoulders, or in your own back, or in your own, right, like with your own body, as a way to like access that. So that's when I also start to think about it that way, Daniela, and I hope that that kind of helps, like I hope that kind of clarifies. But there's a lot more about it in the book's conclusion if you'd like to read it. And I also like happy to talk about that at length, because it's one of my sort of favorite parts of field work, I guess I would say, even when coming into contact with what are really tragic and painful episodes, right? I think there's also something about that kind of physicality that also acknowledges, and also like senses and sort of revitalizes one's connection to the past in ways that oftentimes I don't know, like I don't necessarily always get from just sitting at the Bancroft Library, for example.
Thank you for the answer. I don't know
Sure.
if there is any, oh,
You consider
you were able to hear that, or?
No, could you repeat it?
No. To the- Thank
Hi, thank you for coming to talk. Have you considered demolition
in this framework of explosion. So like, I guess, planned destruction of buildings and sort of the legacies or remains of demolition.
Yeah, absolutely. So, great. Thank you for that question. It's not like a huge part of the book, but yes, in the introduction, one of the things that, and this is sometimes when I give book talks, I do draw on this other part of the book. There's a different book talk that I sometimes do. And I just did like for when I did it at geography at Berkeley recently, I talked about this part of the book. That's actually was one of my favorite to write about. And that I actually touched upon a little bit in this talk with the demolition of islands. So the way in which like deliberately shoals were destroyed and blown up, right? Like is that to me like transformed my entire understanding of the political economy of this entire region of the San Francisco Bay Area. And that is because in order to produce this supposedly natural harbor and this geographic site that is through countless narratives of the Spanish colonizers, of US empire, of like, San Francisco as as Gray Brecken calls it, the sort of it's like the seat of the pyramid of mining that commands this vast hinterland from which it extracts gold, silver, various agricultural resources, et cetera, et cetera. Like at the core of all of that is this very profitable and seemingly endowed by whomever, by God, right? Or by like capital N nature, right? There's this sense that this is this like blessed harbor, right? That this is this like God-given kind of like shaped, sculpted landscape that permits this incredible, it's like this incredible navigable harbor, very protected from the ocean, right? But just like the seat of this incredible like commercial enterprise. But that's completely a myth. Like that's completely false. Like that had to be blown up into shape. All of the shoals had to be cut down under the water in order to make those commercial routes, in order to make space for larger and larger ships. And so there's also like a story of the socioecology of the Bay Area that is the product that's like it's very much created, constructed. It's not like it's not a sort of natural landscape by any means. In fact, when ships used to come in the mid 1800s through the Golden Gate and into the San Francisco Bay, they would navigate by aligning with tall oak trees in the Oakland Hills and the Oakland like Berkeley Hills. And there were like especially two very large oak trees that they would use to try to align ships so that they wouldn't hit the shoals. But curiously enough, capitalist logging destroys the forest. They commercialize the entire like shipment of oak and like mass produced homes. And so it has this whole story with like the commercial development and the real estate of the region, and they destroy the very tools of navigation in the process. And so in order to resolve this problem of navigation, right, they start blowing up rocks and shoals. And so one socio-nature kind of replaces another one, but it also brings about like further ecological devastation. It brings about a different relationship to nature that also then requires continually having to dig out these shipping channels even into the present day, like to even make way for like larger and larger container ships into the 20th and 21st century, or like starting with containers, like starting, after the Vietnam War, but like into the present day. So destruction and demolition, yes. I mean, I only like really kind of like, I love that question because like, partly the role of explosives is often also like, I'm really fascinated by the way in which explosives are often narrativized as like benign, or there's like a kind of like this technology also has like this sort of role in progress in terms of its role in demolition, its role in like making better cities, or in like, but it's always contiguous with militarization. Like it's always tied with weapons making, with its commercialization and an export for wars and for like arming, arming states and so on. So, I mean, there have been tragic and incredible, like also instances like the Beirut blasts during the pandemic that were just like, that wasn't a deliberate demolition by any means, but it does show the sort of socio natures of like this accumulation of ammonia, in that case, ammonium nitrate in the industrial infrastructure of the city to such a concentration that it just like any spark could set it off. And the risks were known. There's a geographer at Rutgers, Mohsen Laban, who writes really, has written brilliant work on the Beirut blast. So that role, their role in demolition and their kind of role, it's like something I'm really fascinated with, and that I always have to tie back to like wars and militarization. I don't think we can untie the two. So thank you for that question too.
There's so much I want to ask, so I'm trying to synthesize my thoughts well for you.
Sure, no rush. I'm not going.
I just moved here from the Bay Area, so I used to live in Santa Ramon, and I have lots of particular thoughts, but I think for the benefit of the group, I've decided I'm going to ask this question. So I'm a student at the climate school here at Columbia, as well as going to be an urban design student next year. And right now in our adaptation courses at the climate school, we've learned from our archaeologist, Christina Douglas, who just won a MacArthur grant, that our best adaptive capacity for climate change has to do with shared social memory, which is huge, right? And so I'm thinking a lot about that. I'm thinking about the way that you've charted memory, and we talked about monuments, and how, it's centering also like kind of this part of explosivity and like how that's manifesting in the Bay Area and all the particularities of that. But I'm also thinking about what happens when our memory is no longer localized, right? So it's put on the internet, it's commodified, whatever, how that becomes a disattachment that then starts to like disembody us. So you guys were kind of starting to go into the body part earlier. So those are some of my mental meanderings. And I'm thinking about like, if we don't have explosivity happening the same way in a literal way, like how does it start to manifest in more of a social way that is unseen? And so I'm thinking about invisibility in that way. So that's like a brain dump that hopefully makes some level of linear sense for those witnessing it. But yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating. I mean, there's so much to think about and unpack there because I think that I mean, yes, that's, as you put it, a brain dump. And I love thinking through like I love thinking through cluttered thoughts myself. I'm actually even trying to kind of think about clutter as a way to also think about a kind of over accumulation of theoretical thoughts and ways that those can really start to make like productive connections. And so like there's so much to kind of think about in terms of these these evolving technologies that are not necessarily new, but ways in which like algorithms, social media, um, create not just like mass reproduced memories, but even like falsified memories, as I think we're well aware of, even exposure to body trauma, to like forms of impersonation and forms of like, just all kinds of nightmares and a kind of hall of mirrors sort of process of memorialization. Um, so, I mean, I think that I don't know exactly how, I mean, I do know ways in which like I have tied that to explosivity, like in my own sort of thinking, not necessarily what makes it into the pages of the book, but yes, in terms of the production of energy for those technologies, like what powers data centers, what are the ways in which, I mean, just this kind of curious overlap between, like there's somewhat newfound interest in nuclear technologies and in forms of like, still like extracting and using nuclear energy to do like these huge capacitate like vast forms of computation and of so-called artificial intelligence. And so that to me is tied to explosivity. But I've also been like horrified. I mean, I think like perhaps in the darkest moments when one thinks about the ways in which those forms of like there's a kind of way in which like computation encodes chemistry, right? And that's something I try to think about a lot. what happens when artificial intelligence starts making explosives? Like what happens when it starts making like chemical cocktails that we had not dreamed of, right? What are some of these are ways in which like I think I I I don't know if like people want to start, there's plenty to do research on, and I think there's like really like there's a lot of dissertations possible, I think in that realm, a lot of research projects that can go sort of thinking about artificial intelligence, advanced computation and um, the chemical geographies of war and weapons and weaponization. So I don't necessarily do so much of that. Unfortunately, and my new projects are in a little bit like different directions, but hopefully other people can take that up because I think there's like really crucial and like dangerous, not that you should put yourself at risk of that, but very dangerous research that is possibly being done in the so-called military industrial complex and like in a kind of vast sort of Silicon Valleyization of of new weapons manufacturing and companies like Anduril, like I don't quite know how to pronounce it, but Palmer Luckey's company and so on. So thank you for that question. I think it's horrifying and there's like tons to sort of consider.
Are there any other questions or? Okay, so I think we're closing for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all
Professor
thank
Javier.
you all for coming. Yeah, and again, I hope to meet you all in person at some point. Hope to come back to New York soon. So hopefully once this travel kind of air travel gets a little bit more normalized. Thank you again for the invitation.